Evet, tekrar hoş geldiniz. Bir an önce başlayalım. Çok kıymetli.
Okay, welcome once again. Without further ado, I'd like to kick off this session. Well, we television presenters, we're very keen on sticking to the allotted time and we are very punctual. So first of all, I'd like to welcome you to the first of Maruf, Marmara Urban Forum. It's wonderful to be organizing this conference, and I'll be chairing the liveliest of sessions and the most interesting in my regard. So the title of the session is Istanbul, the Light of Civilizations, which is quite a vague concept, to be frank. Today we will be talking about literature, architecture, and many other things, and everything will revolve around Istanbul. Let me present you, our panelists. You know them all. We have Iskandar Pala with us, famous author, especially famous for his criticisms, his critical pieces on Ahmet Hamdi Tanpınar. He's a critic, but right now he's rector of Mimar Sinan Fine Arts University. And she is Handan İnci, rector of Mimar Sinan University, Istanbul Kültür Sanat Vakfı, which is the foremost institution when you think of Istanbul and its cultural arts scene, Görgün Tanar, and two architectural panelists, if I may say so, Mr. Murat Gül, welcome, Professor, and last but not least, we have the Dean of the Faculty of Architecture at Istanbul Şehir University, Mr. Uğur Tangeli. So when we first incepted the idea for this session, we contemplated the idea whether we should send in questions and then send back the answers as if this were a TV show. But we nevertheless decided to organize this in form of a panel and give the word to our panelists, the first of which will be taken up by Iskandar Pala, who will kick things off by an anecdote, and then we will proceed with questions and answers that will revolve around the theme and topic of architecture, and the last 15 minutes will be reserved for your questions and answers. Can I speak from the rostrum, please? Yes, of course. Distinguished participants, when I look into this hall, I see many bright faces, young faces, all representatives of the light of Istanbul that it represents. You are the fire, you are the light of the culture and art scene of this wonderful city, and I'm sure you will initiate the momentum with which Istanbul will rise even further on the horizon. And I will read out a text. And before I read this out to you, I thought to myself that when I think of the light of civilizations, and in particular Istanbul, I think of a particular story from the 19th century. The ships that harbored into the Bosphorus, they moored in the Bosphorus and waited until sunrise. They approached the city when the sun was rising, and the captains of these ships, it could be a commercial ship or a croisière, it doesn't matter, they would announce the following: right now we are approaching, we are entering the harbor of the city of lights and the city of domes, and please open your eyes and take a look on the horizon, at the horizon, and imagine a scenery where the sun is rising and everything is crimson red and people are waking up from their night sleep, and then you see the light. You see a first glimpse of green, of lush green, maybe a little bit of crimson red of the tiles of the roofs of the houses. But right now, if you were to take a look at the same horizon, you would see the high rises of Maslak, for example, of the business center. So neither Sultan Ahmet nor the historic peninsula. Right now, if you are on a ship and enter into the Bosphorus, you will see high rises and nothing else. So everything is dominated by these high rises. So the captain's announcement back in the days would be, take a look at the light. And the light means the sun is rising from the east and it reflects its light on 3 domes: Hagia Sophia, Mihrimah Mosque at Edirne Kapı, and Süleymaniye. And the light reflection is wonderful, of course. And the more the ships approach the city of lights, Istanbul, they get this sense of how ancient and how important the city is. So we're talking about a history of many, many thousands of years. All of these centuries and all of these millennials add on top of each other and are enlightened with the light of the civilization. As I've said, Istanbul is the city of lights and domes. It's also a city of dreams. Osman Atilla says the following in one of his poems. Some people have fate, others have not, and many, many different districts represent the light and splendor of this city. And he has this particular poem, which is unfortunately not ready to translate, interpret right on the spot, because we haven't been given the text. We're very sorry. For all of those that listen to the English interpretation, we haven't been given the poems beforehand. This is why we cannot translate them. We're very sorry for that. So basically, in this poem, he is paying reference to the splendor and also the idyllic atmosphere of this city. So even when you stroll the streets of this city, you find yourself in paradise. Paradise being reflected in the pavements of the city. Everyone that roams the streets of this particular city of Istanbul is unique and very knowledgeable and intellectual in itself. It's a city of love as well. During Ahmet III's reign, Aşık lived in Istanbul in his 40s, 50s, and he fell in love with this young woman, and wherever she would go, he would follow. If she were to ride her horse, he would follow her as well, so wherever she went. The girl, understood that she was being followed, and one day she stopped and smiled. "What do you want?" she said. "I am content with your smile. Your smile would be enough. What would you give me in return? You're not rich. You cannot promise me anything. You cannot promise me the world nor an abundant life. You are poor. What can you give me in exchange for my smile?" And the man, being an aşık, "I have one life, and I would give that one life to you. What am I supposed to do with your life? Tell me about something else." And Having said that, the Aşık replied in the following fashion: well, since you want a material thing, you are very attached to the material world, then let me become your slave. Sell me off, and then in return you will get a couple of bucks, and then this will be your material exchange for my smile. And the woman took this man to Çemberlitaş, which is now Çemberlitaş. And back in the days, there used to be a very famous slave market, and there would be a rostrum, and the slaves would be presented in the square, and these slaves would be called kul, and people would sell these people off from dusk till dawn. From dusk till dawn, people would wait for their kuls, for their subjects to be sold. But coming back to this man, nobody was interested in him until the late afternoon. An older man, older than him, he drove by with his car, and the woman was standing by as well. And then the older man asked, "Is this your subject?" And the woman said, "Yes, he is my subject." And the minute she said, "Yes, he is my subject," our subject fainted. And when he woke up, he found himself in Edirne Kapı, inside a car, and he woke up. He came back to his senses. And in front of him, there was no woman, there was just this older man. Some time had passed. And the older man told the Aşık, "I bought you in exchange for such an amount of money. And the reason why I bought you is the following. There was light in your gaze. There was light in your smile. So I thought you might read the Quran, because I don't know how to read the Quran, and my parents are buried in the cemetery close by, and since I don't know how to read the Quran, I wanted somebody to read the Quran for my parents in memoriam." But he took the guy to the cemetery and said the following: "Well, you don't seem to be a bad man. If you want, I can buy you back and give you back your freedom. I free you from your subjectivity, and you can go and work as any commoner would do." "I'm not going to work," he replied, "but one thing I would still like to learn from you. Which direction did the woman go?" He took the address of the woman and went to her place and asked her again, "Would you sell me again in the market, so that I can get a glimpse of your love and of your gaze once again?" Love in Istanbul. It's a very honorable feeling. It's spiritual, it's platonic, it's multi-layered. Whatever your heart permits, this is what you will receive in exchange in Istanbul. Istanbul, it is a source of inspiration. Many people came, and fish season is about to start. Imagine the meeting of two pairs of eyes on the hills of Çamlıca or Üsküdar or in Beyazıt. People that dwelled in Istanbul for a couple of years use these kinds of sentences to describe Istanbul. I know this because I'm an author. I have roughly 90 books that I have written, and half of them deal with Istanbul. The source of inspiration came from Istanbul. Or maybe I'm mistaken. Istanbul gave inspired my books, maybe. People find themselves in a story, a poem, or a fairy tale. And when you open your heart to Istanbul, you may experience sorrow, you may experience love, you may become an aşık as well. So throughout the journey of Istanbul, Istanbul became Istanbul devoid of space and time, and people that fell in love with this city believe that the beauty and splendor and grandeur of the city is endless. This is reflected in every season of the city, from summer to winter, from dusk till dawn, from every leaf to the sun that sheds its light in an orange color. Istanbul is wonderful in every shape and size and every season. Who wouldn't want to read a book that describes the city that they fell in love with? If Istanbul were a color, if Istanbul were an emotion, it would describe a century-old city with every syllable and every letter that is being used. Istanbul is a language that is centuries old, that has been used by many people. When you live in Istanbul, you may not immediately grasp its beauty. It's only that you long for Istanbul when you're far away from it. It draws everyone into under its wings. This is what Istanbul is. It plants its seeds into your heart, into your soul. Istanbul gives birth to desire, from Megara to Constantinopolis to Constantinople to Istanbul. It's reflected in every page that has ever been written about Istanbul. The city walls during Byzantine times, the domes during Ottoman times. Bayram Dervish, who wrote about Istanbul, calls for everyone to come to Istanbul and enjoy even its stones on the pavement. Istanbul is weighed in roses. People that trade roses are the real Istanbuliots. Bridges, waters, floods, the city of gazes. That's what Istanbul is all about. It's the city of kameriye and domes. In Moda, in Karaca Ahmet, in Eyüp Sultan, it doesn't matter where you dwell. There is a person most definitely that will gaze back at you with a smile. The ones that stroll the streets of Istanbul get the feeling that they will enter the gates of a fairy tale. And Istanbul, out of a sudden, touches your heart, touches your soul, as if time and it were devoid of time and place, and it catapults you into another dimension, because this city gives way to much pleasure and to much desire. That's what Napoleon said. If the entire world were one single country, Istanbul would surely have been its capital. And Lamartine said, if you were to take one single look at the world, don't miss out on Istanbul. Take a look at Istanbul. That's what he said. Istanbul now is host to many biennials and festivals, many arts and cultural events. And local administrations and local governments will surely enhance the artfulness and the cultural dimension that Istanbul represents. It is a city of dreams, of inspiration. It is the city of love. It is the city of beauty that is endless. This is the city that you are in right now. The rest is up to you. You just enjoy it. Thank you. Thank you very much, Iskender Pala. Yes, questions and answers will be left to the very end. I would like to give the floor to the panelists to your left. Do you think that Istanbul still represents what Isker Pala has pointed out so beautifully? The Judas trees and the beauty, everything that you've talked about. Do you think Istanbul was able to preserve this? I will come to you in a minute, but let me continue with literature, Mrs. Handan.
Değerli İstanbul.
Well, dear Istanbul aficionados, thank you so much and welcome. Taking the floor after Iskender Pala is going to be rather challenging because following a lyric speech as such, it's going to be a rather didactic speech, and I would like to warn you beforehand. Well, this speech is going to emphasize the importance of Istanbul for literature. On the other hand, it is going to dwell upon the memory space and the importance of establishing a literature museum. On the other hand, it should be sort of an outdoor literature museum where you can wander through the corridors, and we are already very late in terms of establishing those series of discovery journeys, and this is going to simply emphasize that importance of establishing that space. Last but not least, in this typography, author and literary spaces, a powerful contextual and textual streets, structures, buildings have to be simply marked with care, and we have to have an urgent action plan. Let me start with the museum. Well, as the subcommittee of ICOM, we have a very actively working international committee on literary museums, and they prepare bulletins, organize annual activities and conferences every year. And the objective is to make sure that, through the museums of literature, the publications, exhibitions, training activities are simply communicated and shared with the target audience. It occupies a very significant place in ICOM, and the equivalence on a universal basis, unfortunately, is not available in Turkey. I regret to say that. So let's just think of our Turkish literature. Yes, we have some literary houses. You might think of a number of those, but this is not what I mean. This is not what the ICOM sub-literature or literary museums group is working on. So that specifies a very important place in ICOM. And how are we going to replace that? We have ever diminishing and ever getting lost literary spaces. It's not only the literature works from the archives to the remnants of the author. We have to compile them, we have to categorize them, we have to exhibit them. Time is of significant importance in that respect, because when we look at the sense and feeling of belonging, that is lost throughout generations. So, we need to have some protocols, special documents, which have an importance for the literary theory, literary history, while the author is still alive, and we need to have rules for that. I personally know that some of the families of important literature people would like to donate their simply objects, but they are concerned, what if something happens to them? What if those objects are not simply archived or exhibited properly? So we have to actually give support and trust in that respect. This museum has to offer a very thorough and full chronology using digital presentation techniques and featuring a contemporary exhibition attitude. Actually, the history of Turkish literature is sort of the history of Turkish Republic. So, a memory which is comprised of important people, agents, objects, places, and happenings is very important in terms of communicating this memory to the upcoming generations. It's not only going to serve the purpose of refreshing the memories, and it's going to be an alternative channel, learning channel for the upcoming generations. I would like to once again repeat that we don't actually have a very thorough example which is functioning in that international sense. And this is also very significant in terms of the cultural tourism. I'm sure if you have traveled abroad, you go to the probably one of the major or the significant milestones, sort of, the museums which are acting as the milestones of those cities. It could be literary or of any other type. Well, museum is one part of that. On the other hand, Istanbul per se is a museum in itself. So I'm just going to focus on the context, the urban context. An outdoor museum for literature, why not? Istanbul could function as such. In Istanbul, we have, today, we have metropolitan cities, which are actually becoming very similar to one another. That's why cities are utilizing the concept and notion of literature, and the cities are also trying to emphasize their unique selling points. And when we look at Istanbul from that perspective, literature is actually a very significant unique selling proposition in that respect. And, Istanbul has been the cradle of many civilizations, and it has become a very important place or venue in terms of the history, culture, and literature. Well, literature is not only a mastership of words or narratives. Literature is so many things. Before anything else, it is a cultural memory. In terms of the processing cultural heritage, when we look at the pioneers and leaders, they are making maximum use of literature in that category. For example, the famous biographies of well-known authors or their places where they have lived are simply featured as great centers of attraction. Prague, Moscow, in Berlin, Brecht has this house where the newspaper he read before he died was still kept. In Virginia Woolf in United Kingdom, there are still tours, literary tours. So these are big places, you might say. But in Croatia, in the city of Pula, we have a James Joyce statue. Even the population there is not 100,000. Why? Because in between 1904 and 5, he went there to teach English. Can you imagine? And in the capital city, a small city which is 8 hours away from the capital city of Ethiopia, Arthur Rimbaud lived there in a house, and that is retained as it was. And what do they have to do with Arthur Rimbaud? But still, they're keeping it. They're preserving that. Civilization is improving by preserving what is already there. And that refers to a completely different set of mentality. And it's not only preserving the objects, the artifacts of those people, it is emphasizing some routes, creating alternative routes, and meticulously and carefully simply writing down the routes on the maps. And through literature atlases or through some literature wandering routes, it also supports that. Let's have a look at Istanbul, the city of Istanbul, and for centuries it has been very colorfully reflected in literature. Yes, as I told you before, the literature has done what it was supposed to do, but that unfortunately, we fail to simply make it as a center of attraction, let alone the international level, because that also includes the notion of the literary figures and the literature. Even for ourselves, we fail to do that. And recently, we started to see some initiatives, but they're actually very weak, and vis-a-vis the identity and the length of Istanbul's literary position is not sufficient. I think we have to put it under a bigger spotlight. So we have to, this is going to make Istanbul a cultural center of attraction, and this is going to reinforce the relationship between Istanbul and the residents of Istanbul. And there is a great untapped potential, and we have to make sure of that. Preserving the literary figures' houses, let alone preservation, we know that they are intentionally destroyed. We have to create cultural thematic routes. We see that they are done through through individual initiatives, and the narrative, the matching of the narrative or a certain venue or an object. For example, this part in that book happened here. If, for example, we were able to do that, probably we can't even walk on Galata Bridge. So I'm actually, when I say that we are rendering the city and positioning the city as a museum, I'm talking about all these aspects. Let me once again repeat that, and let's do something to come up with solutions. Unfortunately, there is a very undeserved and very major deprivation on the side of Istanbul. The visitors of Istanbul are limited with a number of monuments and historical sites. That's why literature has to be positioned as intangible cultural heritage. We have to integrate it and process it into the memory and the identity of the city. What can we do about that? For example, creating routes, travel routes for Istanbul. We have so many international examples. And we could designate maps, specially referring to the houses of the literary figures. We might have specially educated guides who are taking people onto those tours. And for special literary architectures and places, we might mark them on maps. And in some of the parts, or in the narratives or in the novels, we might have specially designated performances so that they will attract attention. For example, there is a scene in a novel which is very much associated with Istanbul. It might be performed at a given time. All of a sudden, we see that live in action. And special signs put onto the houses of the literary figures. We are unfortunately so delighted. Even for Ahmet Hamdi Tanpınar in Gümüşsuyu, I was not able to do that. Let's have frequent and regular symposia and some meetings, workshops in that given neighborhood. And we might come up with new methods of rejuvenation. For example, literature houses or author houses. Unfortunately, we have been trying to do that for quite some time, and we're so late in that respect. And we might invite international authors so that they will simply make up their own creations, and Istanbul will play a very significant role in those narratives. The residents of Istanbul, they will enjoy living in Istanbul while encountering the remnants, the traces of the people they read. I'm sure you have all been in that position. That's going to be a great pleasure if we are able to do all this, because if we do all those, we're going to have one thing, creating the awareness or consciousness of being an Istanbulite. So, you don't become a person, you don't become an Istanbulite, by default if you were born in Istanbul, just like me actually, because what makes you an Istanbulite is actually the literature. In 1953 and 4, in the Istanbul Regional Development Plan, there is unfortunately this shortcoming in terms of people having that feeling of belonging into Istanbul, and because there was a survey which was conducted, no one responded to the questions that they actually feel real Istanbulites, including the people who were born in Istanbul. And the most important method to overcome that is through literature. So the literature, in order to integrate celebrate the literary heritage of Istanbul, we have to make sure that the residents and people who are living in Istanbul become a part of that. Let me start with some tangible recommendations. Okay, we actually, we're talking about ideal situations, but we were actually able to do one, and we got great results. Tanpınar Center of Literary Research, we took one novel, and Ahmet Hamdi Tanpınar is actually the main land of Istanbul literary world. Even his novels alone are sufficient, and he is on his own, is a cultural heritage. With my fellow researchers and my students, we worked on the digital maps of such novels, and we organized tours. They were a huge success. We actually shared those on social media. Many people wanted to participate in those. They were very much influenced and impressed by our vibe. And people who have not read Huzur or Peace, as the translated name follows, wanted to simply read that, and the way they experience Istanbul and see Istanbul was completely altered. See, that was actually the impact we left. If we do that in collaboration with the relevant institutions and the Ministry of National Education and Culture, I'm sure we will simply upscale that. And the last example happened last week. We had youth from Hacettepe University to Istanbul. They came to Istanbul, and we had an app, and we sent the maps, and they discovered Istanbul using those maps. That was a great feedback we got from that. And they started, what started in the form of individual initiatives were a huge success. It's not only Ahmet Hamdi Tanpınar. We have so many successful names and so many successful works of art, and the consciousness of being an Istanbulite and acquiring the pleasure to live in Istanbul. This is what we have to do. If you would like to preserve one thing, you have to love that. Only then, you will be able to love it and preserve it, and that is true simply contemplating over what you try to preserve. Literature is actually probably one of the most straightforward and most functional and useful methods. And unfortunately, we fail to maximize that. In a nutshell, literature, as you could see, it's a social memory. Layer by layer, we see the accumulation of culture. And there is this social archaeology, and this is establishing the foundations of that. We are walking on that, and we are making yet another addition every day to that memory, and by remembering anything, we are expanding it. And the only way actually to preserve Istanbul is through knowing what kind of soil or ground that we are standing. Then what to do? As much as possible and as soon as possible, we have to integrate more of that memory into our daily life, and we have to have meaningful platforms. That's why, first of all, we have to have a magnificent literature museum in Istanbul, and then we have to create specially designated literature routes, and we will try and speak to Istanbul. Thank you so much.
Çok teşekkürler Hande Hanım. Ben şimdi soru cevap bölümüne geçmeden burada bir soru.
Thank you very much. Before we proceed with the Q&A session, I would like to intervene and say the following. The Marmara Urban Forum is a platform for us not only to exchange good wishes and our thoughts. Maybe we can act as intermediaries, as middlemen and women, so to speak, to convey messages to the regulators and to the decision makers. Well, you've mentioned a couple of museums. There is Orhan Veli's house at Aşiyan Cemetery. There is Said Faik Abbasiyanık in Burgazada, one of the Princess Islands, and some other literary houses and artists' houses as well, authors' houses, many of which we don't even know, let alone have visited. So maybe you could, dear participants, tell us through which authors' houses and which authors' literary routes you would like to explore this city. Any other name that is dear to your heart apart from Ahmet Hamdi Tanpınar? Let me give you the two names that are closest to my heart. Orhan Pamuk, you may well have guessed, and Said Faik, of course. Unfortunately, we cannot hear the lady. She doesn't use a mic. She's not using a microphone. Mrs. Handan, you mentioned that families of deceased authors have difficulties to donate the author's personal belongings. What about you, Iskandar Pala? Would you have an idea to contribute? Well, some of my work is being displayed at the Tanpınar Museum. And from time to time, this is subject of discussion at my household. My children, they think about setting aside a couple of belongings. But I'm a little concerned because, well, that's a joke, of course. But what will happen to me, or where will I end up if my children donate the last bits and pieces of my personal belongings, including my house? That's of course a joke, but as Mrs. Handan mentioned, literary museums and authors' houses and literary routes of exploration for this city are in dire need, and people want that. What's your author of choice? Somebody that definitely deserves a museum. Cemil Meriç, the house that he lived in belongs to the municipality, and it is being used as a tea garden. As a tea garden. This is very unfortunate. So this could very well be turned into an author's house or a literary museum. Thank you very much. Now I would like to give the floor to Mr. Görgün Taner, Director of İKSV. Mrs. Handan mentioned a route. I know you do musical routes. What's up and coming for İKSV in the future? What about literary routes? And how will you shape the arts and cultural landscape of Istanbul? Thank you very much. Well, after the two distinguished professors, this came as a surprise. I thought architecture would come first, and then the last word would be left to me. I'm sure the distinguished professors will talk about the current situation of Istanbul in a mere minute, but let me talk a little bit about the light of civilizations in a couple of sentences. Well, the panelists before me talked about many, important aspects, and I would like to dwell on the future a little bit. If we were to turn towards the future, I'm not very knowledgeable about the past. I would consider myself more knowledgeable about the future. So with your permission, I would like to utter a couple of sentences regarding that. As has been mentioned, Istanbul is roughly 8,000 years old. It has an incredible history to its credit, capital of three important empires. How are we to catapult this legacy into the future? What has happened so far and what will happen in the future? Let us look at that. This is a transformation of culture as well, because Istanbul sits on top of many different important cultural layers. The Roman Empire, it starts way back from the Neolithic era, coming all the way to the Turkish Republic today. We have civic architecture, we have mosques, we have libraries and synagogues and churches, literature, language, and so on and so forth. So everything that you can think of enables us to transform and transfer the past to the future. We're talking about an 8 millennia old history, and taking a little courage from a literary museum idea. And this is being broadcasted, so let me take this opportunity. Hey, this is my shout out to you. Let me make a call and regarding this. After the Yenikapı excavations, we found out that the city dates way back. The city's history is even older than that we thought of. Yenikapı excavations. In 2006, it reached a peak, and 2010 there was a competition regarding that. There was an architecture that was selected. His project was selected, and let me not bother you with all the bureaucratic steps in between, but in the end, well, this idea was incepted, but still nada, if I may say so. So we're today talking about what to do and how to do. We have 37 like sunken ships, and still we're not doing anything. If you put together culture and tourism, us cultural people, we don't really like the idea, but this could also be considered a source of income. It's also a very important excavation that was made, these 37 sunken harbors and ships that were discovered. It's been quite a while, so let's make good use of that. Let's not waste that. So culture is really a very labor-intensive concept. We're talking about it. Let's get to a common denominator. What with this concept? Let me read out UNESCO's definition. Culture is a differentiating factor culturally, spiritually, or in other words, is most commonly defined as a complex whole which includes knowledge, beliefs, arts, morals, laws, customs, and any other capabilities and habits acquired by a human as a member of society. This is UNESCO's cultural definition of culture. So what do we need to do for the future? What should be the city's approach to take up this issue? Cities developing solutions and cities that are creative. This is a very this concept is very up and coming. What should be the stance of these cities? What should be the climate in which these cities should operate? Today, as you know, urban spaces are very important. Istanbul, 16 million, Shanghai, even more. And urbanization ratio is almost 90%. So in a way, the star is rising of cities. The stars of cities are rising. And this is how the light of a city is transferred. This is the climate that we should be operating in. So what is the future that we are heading towards? What's the direction that the light is facing towards? This is my answer. This would be my answer. And we need a climate for that to happen, a suitable one. So let's take a look at grounds still to be covered. Yes, I'm an Istanbulite. I'm from Istanbul. I'm very proud to be one. But in the overall index of cities that offer the best quality of life, Istanbul constantly ranks 130. This is very low, let's be honest. What can we do to raise that, to get a better ranking? Maybe if we adopted an architectural approach to not invest in high rises, for example, and to sprawl instead of go vertical, that could be a solution. Why not? We constantly work on 5-year development plans. We put them aside afterwards and take a look at capital and so on and so forth, and then planning gets on the back burner. Yeni Kapı excavations. Why not invest in that? And what if Iskandar Pala, for example, insists on his own museum, for example? What should we do then? So for all that, we need to have a plan, a concrete plan, and we need to have a dimension. We need to have a plane on which we can operate in. We need to have an inventory feasibility plan. What's going to await us, what's awaiting us, what do we need to invest in, what's the time frame, and after setting aside the necessary time, we need to step into action. Why? Because if you put Istanbul's numbers aside, other cities, well, it doesn't look that bad, because when you do an inventory of different cultural, sites and so on and so forth, Istanbul is really up there. And if you look at international rankings, however, what with popularity and so on and so forth, Istanbul doesn't really rank that high. We really need to put the meticulous effort into all our cultural heritage and then build everything else around it. Well, planning is of course very arduous and very boring, to be frank, but nothing works without planning. It's 14:56, by the way, so I will stop here and give the floor to the other panelists. Well, this was a surprise. You took the floor by surprise, and you hand over the floor by surprise as well.
Well, Murat Bey, let's continue with you. Architecture. It's going to be Q&A, in the form of Q&A. Istanbul, the light of civilizations, is the theme of our panel. But currently, do you think Istanbul has an urban landscape which reflects that light? Or is it completely the contrary, where we fail to preserve and keep the light of the city? Why are we ranking 130? Well, first of all, thank you so much. It is actually is a very deeply intellectual panel, and we had great eye-opening speeches or presentations. I'm not going to be very positive, but I'm still an avid optimistic, and I will do my best to simply refer to that tone. And let's start with that ranking, 130. Such indicators are very important. In all of our professions, we do care about the rankings and the numbers, and that's what we have to do. But it's not all about them. For example, this year, world second, and in the 2 decades, I lived and resided in a city which has been always in top 5 in the last 2 decades. But I'm so happy to be living in Istanbul, despite all the problems and challenges everyone mentioned. Istanbul, when we look at the written literature, the written history, which is dating back to 2,700 years, but in the informal records, we know that it's even longer than that, almost 8 or 7 millennia. And there were turmoils, ups and downs in the history of Istanbul. I don't have time to develop on those, and I don't need to do, because all the professors and students and the participants know that. And as in response to your question, are we in a position to sustain that light? It's rather difficult to offer a definite answer to that. Our colleagues, and this is something we discuss with our colleagues and our students, and there is such a notion which has sort of become a cliche, the notion of migration. After the regression and the destruction of Ottoman Empire, it sort of came to a halt in the Republican area, and there was a huge migration influx of people, the end of 19th century. Probably, I'm sure, we all have those family members in our own families who had to come to the motherland, to Turkey, from different parts of the empire. And that migration has put a huge burden on Istanbul. And 19th century was not particularly very bright for Istanbul. But still, there might be different answers. And after 1945, in the aftermath of the World War II, there was a different policy and there was a different economical order. And in 1940s, it used to be even less than the urbanization rate used to be less than 20%, and in time it soared to 40%, 60%, and in real terms it's 80%, because with the new metropolitan law, even the villages are now affiliated with the cities, but it's not the case. So the real urbanization rate is 80-85%, major cities and their population. And within that context, and in that panic, so to say, or in that rush, while we were urbanizing on one hand, and unfortunately we failed to preserve some of our values. I think, this could be seen in a similar vein to the adventure of United Kingdom throughout the industrialization. Manchester, was one of the very popular favorite places of the industrial revolution, and their population was increased by 6 times in all of the cities of the United Kingdom: Liverpool, Manchester, Birmingham, and London, and in many other cities. Because of that rapid urbanization and industrialization, there were very severe problems. And it's not something, it's not like we see pinkish, cheeky children or beautiful dames wandering the streets of United Kingdom. No, that's far from reality. And with a certain delay, particularly in the aftermath of the Second World War, we experienced that change. We were in a rush, and to the best of our capacity, we preserved some of the values. We could have done better work. So if you have any other questions, right at this point, if we simply continue. I work for Habertürk, and it's actually a relatively high place. And if I simply stare throughout the window from Dolapdere to Kasımpaşa, I see houses just like small boxes which are adjacent to one another. There is no common thread, no color, no common color, and thousands of buildings looking at one another. Because on one hand we are talking about the Judas trees overlooking Bosphorus, and on the other hand we have an Istanbul silhouette which is comprised of mainly of buildings which are not necessarily aesthetical. And this is my question to you. These contractors which are rather separated from one another, and were we really in a position to simply be relying upon these people without any aesthetical taste? And were there some good examples in that respect? And are we in an irreversible point? So a number of important things, such high-rise buildings and silhouette. This is actually one of the biggest complaints and concerns if you're talking about the city of Istanbul. But I think there are fuzzy boundaries. Not everything is all black or white, because all throughout the history, at different times, high-rise buildings, to a certain extent, were all built, and they kept their iconic landmark identities or made a certain contribution to the city. So we come up with formulas such as horizontal architecture. It's as if it's going to fix every problem we have if it's a horizontal architecture, which is not necessarily the case. Well, we have been rather generous in terms of the high-rise buildings without necessarily filtering them through using a number of criteria, and they could be rather ugly and problematic. Coming to the second question. Did we have could we have created some other environment? With academics, I mean, in theory, on paper, I would always say yes, but it would always be followed by other questions which start with if, and the answer would be yes. So then looking at the PEG, the permits or the administration policies, could they change? I know it's a rather extreme example. When you look at Rome, even the scheme of color is there. You can't use any other tone or shade, which is not an earth color, earth tone, in order to paint the colors in order to paint your color. So this is there. So can we do that, or am I being unfair to Istanbul? No, you're not being unfair, because when we're talking about the city, there is this very fine line between our freedoms and what we wish to do. And Richard Meyer from Rome is a very well-known architect and is a member of New York 5. And all of his buildings are white. And in Rome, Arapaci, he built a building called Arapaci. All of the Roman people and the mayors, they protest because it was not compliant with the color scale of Rome. If it's Turkey, I wonder how many people would do that. So maybe it's not in our embedded DNA or culture to simply work with such a number of rules. I mean, it's okay, but that irregularity should be managed at a certain level. That would be more realistic, because every culture, even, all of the cities in Italy are quite different from one another. You do this in Rome, in Naples, or in Florence, it's completely something else. So moving from our own, departing from our own realities, we should find a way in between how to administer everything. We don't have one size fits all or magical solutions. I remember very well, I was in secondary school back then. There was this Quetta of the 1980, and all of the buildings which were overlooking E5 was painted all in white by the mayor of Istanbul, who was assigned among the soldiers from the army. So actually we should be self-critical. And most of our houses are going through urban regeneration, and we are buying houses, we are building houses. Whenever we commission our house to an architect or a contractor or developer, to what extent that fits the overall spirit of Istanbul, or reflecting the architecture understanding, or in terms of training, is it going to be possible to disseminate it to the upcoming generation? The short answer is no. We never take that into consideration if you need the truth, and unfortunately we fail to do so. But expecting that could be rather away from the realities. That's where I'm a little bit concerned, because sometimes we think and desire to have a world. That's what we have, that's what we want, and I'm not sure whether that really complies with the reality. Particularly because of the earthquake, which happened 3 days ago, urban regeneration became another hot topic. And there are different schools of thought. We mismanaged that. Urban regeneration was interpreted as a way to simply increase your yield. The flat owners saw this as a method to simply have one more flat out of that. The contractors saw that as a way of making more money. The local administration saw that as a great facilitation and simply keeping them away from trouble. But we saw that it didn't turn out to be as such. A fast example. I think Kadıköy, probably Kızıl Toprak, all the way to Bostancı, where you will be the last place to have urban regeneration, became #1 place. Why? Because there was this potential money, and it was very much simply enabling that. Now I would like to simply continue with Uğur Tanyeli. Are you as pessimistic as Murat Bey? Can we simply make it better in terms of the urban silhouette of Istanbul? We have that fuzzy boundaries or that complication in architecture. Is Istanbul going to lose its light? So what would you say?
Konuşmaya başlayayım. Ben iflah olmaz bir iyimserim zaten.
Well, I'm an optimist, a fully fledged optimist. But let me preface everything by saying the following. We are constantly mixing up apples and pears. Istanbul is not a Rome. Well, we were referring to like urban management and municipalities. Well, this is not a piece of criticism for you, but this is very, very common in Turkey, comparing the wrong stuff. Istanbul, if you want to compare it with anything, you could compare it with Tokyo or Shanghai, or in a way with Hong Kong, but with nothing else. Because Rome is something else. Rome, with 2 million inhabitants, is a city that was able to preserve its structural features. And Istanbul is undergoing quite a different situation when you take a look at 19th century Rome. It is the Rome that you have today, the Rome from 1900s. It's a product of Italian urbanization, which was back in the day quite accelerated, but nevertheless it looks beautiful to us today. But in those times, it was very problematic in its own way. The same holds true for Paris. Paris today dates back to only 1860. What you see today is only modern Paris. But we are a community or a city that is not resembling this in any way. We could be compared to Bombay or to Shanghai or Tokyo, but the thing is that we do not want to resemble them. We have ideals. Resembling or being compared to Shanghai or to Dubai is not something that we aspire to. Everything that we want to aspire to is completely different, right? So we want and we have to change our ideals. We do not want to live in a city that resembles Shanghai. Would you want to live in Shanghai? I personally wouldn't want to, but in a way I don't want to live in Istanbul either, because Istanbul is not, let's be frank, the city that is the easiest to live in. Let's be honest. So is Istanbul good? Is Istanbul bad? Will it improve in the future? Improving and improvement in history is non-existent. That I know for a fact. I'm an historian, and problems are not solved. Problems exist for a specific period of time. You define them, you try to grasp the world via through these problems that they present, and then you forget about these problems and you create other sets of problems. That does not mean that you have solved the problems that once existed. That's how it goes. So urban landscapes and urban spaces do not have a dynamic that is keen on solving problems. It creates problems. You grasp the reality that presents itself to you. You interpret it through these problems, and then you forget about these problems. So when you ask what's going to happen, well, I don't have an answer. I'm not an oracle. We're going to forget these problems. You can be sure of that. In 30 years, we will not ask the same sets of questions. The questions that were asked during my childhood, during my when I was young, when I was a student of architecture, are not the same that are asked right now. gecekonduz, the houses that are built overnight, and so on and so forth. Those were the questions that we were discussing back then. Right now, these gecekonduz are non-existent. Nobody is building their own house. It's the contractors, it's the developers that build houses. So, as you see, the ground of discussion slipped away. But having said that, I would like to point out another issue, something that we tend to forget. The rise of Istanbul is really the most unimportant question here. Every building in Istanbul resembles one another. Well, of course, so do the buildings in Shanghai. So do the buildings in Dubai. All the buildings look alike. But the question is, what is our perspective on the historicity of this urban space? We cannot come to a common denominator, to a common ground vis-à-vis the history of this city. Some fragments in time we haven't come to peace with. We have the Ottoman Empire, we have the Ottoman period, we have before that the Byzantine Empire or the period. Do we have a Byzantine museum? Do we have a museum of Byzantine art? Well, Byzantine museums exist elsewhere, void of context, outside of its context, but not here. We do have artifacts, Byzantine artifacts, but they are stored in storage houses and warehouses. We do not even want to acknowledge their existence. We do not want to see them. Have you ever come across somebody that wants to restore Theodosius's palace and what's left of those times? No one. During my childhood, the most important bits and pieces of those times were excavated. Do we know where they are? No one wants to restore those buildings that are leftovers from those times. Anastylisiosis is really the key word here. The most part of these buildings are in good condition, ready to be restored, but nobody takes care of that. This has nothing to do with the high rises. This has nothing to do with the speculations and the current situations. This is really a neglected part of history. We only want to love and hold dear a 500-year-long historical period and forget about everything else. If I told you that the buildings of the 18th century are very valuable, I would get the following response. 18th century buildings, why should they be valuable and important? Well, they are replicas of European architecture from the 1800s. And a couple of years ago, shall we preserve and conserve Beyoğlu and the architecture of Beyoğlu? Well, nobody would respond with a yes, because there is no proper building in Beyoğlu, is what people would say. So, long story short, there are bits and pieces throughout history that we love and others that we hate and do not hold dear. And this is our general approach to history in general and also to Istanbul. There is no way that we can solve all the problems of Istanbul. This is the current situation that we are living in. This is something we should consider, and it's not possible to solve things and to change things overnight in 1 day or 2 days. Is something changing? Well, yes, it is. Throughout a couple of centuries, well, we have covered some ground. Was it a lot of ground? No. A lot of history of Istanbul is still being neglected. All the Byzantine ships are not being displayed. We are unable in a way to display that. Maritime history and Istanbul, a unique combination, and we await unique pieces that will shed light to worldwide maritime history, but still we are not taking care of this part of history. because they are Byzantine ships. And if you take a look at history like this, you will create danger zones throughout history, and danger zones equal landmines. Istanbul is an eternal landmine for us. We are so afraid of stepping on the wrong stones, so to speak. So if that's the case, it's really impossible, a thing of impossibility to preserve the cultural legacy of Istanbul, to talk about the future of Istanbul. Do we have an urban city museum at all? Osman Nuri Ergin, back in 1930, was sent to Europe with the mandate to incept a city museum. He collected important artifacts and important documents pertaining to the history of Istanbul. And he made some serious efforts regarding that. Is anyone able to detect what he collected back in the day? Well, it was only once displayed at Yıldız Palace, and then they disappeared, miraculously. This is an environment of fear. This is where we are living in. This is an environment of fear pertaining to our own history. So, given that, I don't really think that we will be able to cover any more ground. Well, this is, I think, hinting at cultural policy, right? Iskender Pala, maybe you can dwell on this subject a little bit. You also work together with the prime minister's, with the head of state's office. Do you think we will be able to cover some ground in that regard?
Ben burada konuştuğum
Well, everything we have discussed here today, from the literary museum to the cultural aspect of the city, carrying that into the future, the regularity of the architecture. So everything actually, I have simply thought, analyzed in my head, and this is what I came up with. I'm 60 years old, and the things I was discussing at the age of 15 could be achieved at the age of 30. That's what I remember thinking. And the problems I was thinking of at the age of 30 could be also doable, and they could be overcome at the age of 45. So it's actually all about the understanding, which is very much in line with the planning, including the urban planning, the local or the central administration's sensitivities, something that this has direct correlation with. But, you know, we have the young people who are among the audience. Maybe in the upcoming 2 decades, they're probably going to remember today. Well, at a panel, I remember these were the people who were simply discussing these aspects. When they have certain responsibilities and authorities, they are going to simply overcome those problems. Half of the problem is being aware of those problems and discussing those. So it's not about being in favor or against the Byzantine culture. Of course, it's not acceptable. And I believe Uğur Bey just wanted to give an example. He chose Byzantium Empire as an example because we have to preserve the same works of art for the Ottoman or the early Republican times. So, and it does not have to be limited with architecture, a certain notion of civilization, and anything offering and lending itself to the definition of a culture. And I believe that should be the advocacy. If not, then I have an office in Sultanahmet, and the tourists in Sultanahmet are whom I observe every morning and every evening. And all of the incoming tourists to Istanbul, and I check the venues where they visit. It's completely Byzantium Empire, completely. Only we have Süleymaniye, we have Blue Mosque, and only these days it's actually restored. That's why they sort of skip it. Every where they visit, it's Byzantium Empire. And this is probably what they have in mind. Why those Turks occupied these lands? I am in charge of everything. Everything is actually what we own. And they seem to be sort of the occupying forces. We should not let this happen, but also we should not facilitate or enable any alienation. So layer by layer, every pattern, every cultural aspect. I own everything. Rome is mine, Byzantium is mine, Seljuk Empire is mine, Phrygian Empire, Lydian Empire. So layer by layer, this is what constitutes Anatolia. But today, I'm the Republic of Turkey. That's how we should approach such aspects. So vis-a-vis the cultural policies, everything we discuss here, the Committee on Urbanization Policies are discussing what we discuss here because we have a common member, and I know even the media does not know about the content of such meetings. Maybe you might want to share some of those. So about the culture and arts, what Görgün Bey indicated and what Handan Hanım indicated, we are discussing everything and we draft reports. And we also offer policy recommendations to the relevant authorities, whoever they are. So my point is, everything we discuss today, currently here, could be changed with a certain understanding. It's not up to the central or the local administration or government. It is indeed the solution is lying in the minds of these young people over here. Because we have lost our vicinity, our surrounding, our aristocracy, people who will be the patron of arts, culture, architecture. So it is through the local administration or the central government that the culture and arts are supported and funded, and even that per se is an indicator of the mismanagement that we are offering. So it should be such a way that financial conglomerate companies, or who are the capital owners, I don't know those, but just for God's sake, just tell me, Avea, Turkcell do they have, these companies, major companies, do they have a cultural consultant? Or probably İş Bankası, İşbank has one. Görgün Bey, let's ask you, do they have one? Even that is a repercussion, has a repercussion on the culture and art policy. So as long as it's actually a sort of a pain in our or a regret in terms of culture and art, we won't be discussing this in the upcoming 2 to 4 decades. Yeah, I know that. The banks have such a cultural consultant. I know it's actually a very lengthy discussion. We have only 4 minutes left. And in majority of the European countries, both the local administrations, then there is also the federal administration, and the ministries of culture support the cultural institutions as well as the activities of arts and culture. In most of the other countries, the fact that there is no central government or state support, it is what we say, the arm's length, whether that could be preserved or not, because there are concerns in preserving that. Because in a global population of 8 billion, well, did the state, when the state funds our concerts, for example, will they impose any recruitment, employment, or anything? And the states, the big states, well, I'm paying you this much money, but then I'm going to ask for some feedback in return. How many, what is the coverage rate, what is the participation, and they're using some independent criteria to measure the success of that given cultural activity. Let alone the Western countries, China, 1.5 billion population of China, and in Russia, even, you won't believe me, but even in the United States of America, there is this state support and funding of art and culture. But if the method is how I depict it, then that makes sense. If it is to the extent of censorship, then we could do very well without that. One last thing before I finish. İskender Bey mentioned banks. İşbank as a cultural consultant, the discussion is not about the other banks. The real aspect is that if we place culture and art to the core of what we do, and if we speak the same jargon, being on the same page with the definitions. For example, simply owning, it's a great expression. The young people are going to own it. Being inclusive, that's very important. You have to be inclusive. You have to simply embrace everyone. The rule of law. Your state should be number one in the rule of law, not only cultural, economically speaking, socially speaking, freedom of expression. You should strive to be number one in that category as well. If you simply check all those boxes, the culture, the art, it's going to be a natural extension by that. We said Istanbul is sitting upon a history of 8 millennia, and when they come and look back retrospectively at today's Turkey, they should be simply analyzing, and they should be marveling at what we did in Istanbul. One last bit, you were saying something about architects. My professors did not say that. Well, I think it's actually a fresh wound of Istanbul. Indicating the specific name of a certain architect of a certain building is something which we could do only in the last decade. Previously, it used to be the companies, development companies, and I think the architects are sort of playing a more sparing role, but if I'm mistaken, just correct me if I'm wrong. Well, actually, it would be unfair to limit this with the last decade. Well, 2 decades, okay, but still. İskender Bey also indicated that when we are discussing the heritage, starting from the Antiquity, Byzantium, all of the eras of Ottoman Empire. When I was a student, by the way, I was a student back in the 1980s, 90s, not 50s, but you were right. They would simply say that 19th century buildings are merely a result of a corruption, an architecture corruption. But, we failed to simply preserve the early Republican buildings, and the ones following that. We have hundreds of thousands of buildings whose architects are known. But recently, we have the ever-changing conditions. Buildings are more visible, maybe more grand, and we have some fresh information pertaining to the recent times, but the problem is beyond whether we have good architecture or not. The public squares and how they're integrated with the architecture, that's a major problem. Because, if we just live here, that is one of the best walking tours from Taksim to Maslak, our main campus. It's actually a flat route. It's a great pleasure. And we have so many late Ottoman works, buildings, until the early Republican. But do we actually have a sufficient place to simply walk? Some of the buildings are rather poor, but we have some of the great ones which are representing their own eras. But, to what extent they are integrated with the high quality public sphere, that's what we have to think. It's inaudible. He has to turn on his mic. Well, now that you get to ask the architects, I have a degree in architecture, but I was not a practicing architect. Well, just the thing about knowing the names of the architects is not our individual ignorance. The Minister of Urbanization and Environment prepared a 4-volume book of Turkish architecture featuring 90 architects. And I wrote down the prelude to the book, and that's one thing I said over there. Only, an encyclopedia of architecture, only in one century in Germany features 1,200 architects, or in another catalog of United States, 8,000 architects are mentioned, and it's 80 to 90 in Turkey, according to the encyclopedia, which points out to the fact that we are not individually indifferent. We have the contemporary architecture career, professional career, only could be dated back to the beginning of the 20th century. However, you know, if it's Central Italy, that would mean that is dating back to the 14th century. If it's United States of America, 18th century. If it's Germany, 16th century, mid-16th century. So almost for every building, you would know the architect, more or less. So it's actually a completely different historical process. So it's not, you know, the blame is not on us, actually. It's actually completely that we are coming from a different historical process, and we simply end up with knowing a number of limited architects. 80% of the buildings. Who did those? Who erected those? We don't know that. Even in the municipality, they were not registered until 1950s. Let me tell you that which building was erected by which architect. If I'm not mistaken, that practice started in 1957. In Ankara, it was the beginning of 1930s. Ankara municipality started from 1930s. They wrote down in the name of the architect for every project. Istanbul was never actually prone to archiving. It was very peaceful. But starting from the 1957, they somehow noted down the names of the architects. So this is actually because of the fact that Turkey is indeed positioned in another historical reality. Is it our fault? No, it's not. It's completely different world, actually. We have a completely different history. It's not like the other. It's inaudible. If you ask me whether that points to that, well, in terms of the intellectual respect, I'm so sorry. We are in the last 10 minutes because there's going to be another panel right after us. I understand there was not much interest in the app, which I assume you have questions to ask here in person. If you have any questions, please raise your hand and speak to the microphone.
Galiba mikrofonumuz var mıydı arkadaşlar? Yoksa biraz yüksek sesle dinleyelim sizi. Mikrofon gel.
Here's the microphone. Please use it. Thank you very much to all the panelists, and particularly to Iskender Pala. I really miss the meetings that we held back at Istanbul Kültür University. So there has been a discussion going on, and we discussed the following. We're not really at peace with our culture and our city, with our culture, and neither with our history. So if we come to peace with our culture and our history, it looks like we will be able to solve our problems after all. On my way here, I saw on a poster, on a billboard, that Shovatava was being celebrated, and the municipality congratulated our Jewish citizens, something that I hadn't come across before. So what I wanted to say is that most of the panelists mentioned that we're not at peace with our history, and a lot of artifacts went unknown and undiscovered. I know for a fact that some stones on my way to school back in the day were used as bidets or toilets, as a lavatory pan maybe. So mobility programs are very useful. So you are basically saying that Istanbul needs an application with which they can... We cannot hear the speaker anymore because the microphones are on at the same time. This is why we cannot interpret the person that is asking the question. We cannot hear the speaker, unfortunately. Thank you very much for this interesting recommendation, suggestion. Any other questions or comments? We cannot hear the speaker because the microphone on the stage is turned on and at the same time. Well, I'm an archaeologist. Can you please turn off the mic on the stage? We cannot hear the speaker properly because two mics are turned on at the same time.
Beraber her yeri binanın yapıldığında gözlemleyebiliyoruz. Ben şu anda kendim Büyükşehir Belediyesi'nde görevliyim, Balat'ta. Surun dibine bir bina inşaatı yapılabildi. Arkeoloji Müzesi'ni arıyorum.
This is yet the same announcement. We cannot hear the speaker because two mics are turned on at the same time. Yes, very interesting comment. Thank you very much. A question that we received through the application. Is there any institution that reviews whether restorations in order to preserve historical artifacts are performed according to the Vedic statute? I'm not a restaurateur for the, at all. I don't have anything to do with that. It's my wife that is the expert in that, and she's looking at me with these big eyes. But let me say that there is no such institution. There is no institution that is overseeing whether the restorations in Turkey are performed according to the rules and procedures. So no international institution would oversee a restoration in Turkey either. But of course we receive criticism quite frequently because restorations in Turkey are not really performed according to rules and procedures, and we tend to overhear that. Can mistakes be corrected? Well, it depends on the mistake you commit. I don't know how. Some mistakes cannot be corrected. Big mistakes in terms of restoration, they are not reversible. But the basic issue is that the modern restoration is reversible, meaning that whatever you do in terms of restoration should be correctable. This is sort of a principle of restoration. That's all I can say pertaining to this particular question. Thank you very much. I would like to close this panel with a suggestion. Maruf will be organized every 2 years, and I would suggest for everyone to follow up on everything that we have discussed today. Make yourself some notes. How many literary houses and museums have been opened? Let's meet in 2 years in order to discuss whether everything that we've discussed today came to fruition. Thank you very much.